people ask me what kind of batteries I use the energizing type. The little bunny, you know. So the Lord keeps me going. We're going to go to page 27 in our syllabus, page 27. And we are going to study the notes on Revelation 12. Notes on Revelation 12. And I'm going to go through this material as quickly as possible. It's going to take us the session this afternoon, and it's going to take us the first 2 sessions tomorrow morning to finish this material. But Revelation 12 is foundational to Revelation 13 and Revelation chapter 17. So we are going to take our time in studying this material. Now, in Revelation chapter 12, we have 3 centers of focus. 3 centers of focus. And when we have our prayer, we are going to take a look at those 3 centers of focus. The rest of our time together, today and tomorrow, when we study this material, is going to be on these 3 centers of focus. So let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you that we're able to gather together again to study this lesson. We ask for the guidance of your Holy Spirit. Give us clarity of thought. Help us to understand the deep things of God. And we thank you for your presence with us and for being answering our prayer, because we ask it in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. As I was mentioning, Revelation chapter 12 has 3 centers of focus, and you have it in your material. Number 1, Revelation 12, 1 through 5, is amplified in Revelation 12, verses 7 through 12. In other words, Revelation 12 is not in chronological order. The events don't transpire one right after the other throughout the course of the chapter. The chapter has 3 repetitive cycles, where what you have at the beginning of the chapter is amplified later on at the end of the chapter. So in Revelation 12, 1 through 5, you have an amplification of that in Revelation 12, 7 through 12. And the center of focus in those verses is the child. And he doesn't stay a child forever. It's the child who is later caught up to God and to his throne. In other words, the center of focus is Jesus in chapter 12, verses 1 through 5 and verses 7 through 12. Only verses 7 through 12 are an amplification of verses 1 through 5. Then the second central focus of the chapter is Revelation 12, verse 6. And that verse is amplified further in Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 through 16. So we need to understand that verse 6 is the intro, and then that is amplified at the end of the chapter in verses 13 through 16. And then the third center of focus is Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17. When the dragon is enraged with the woman and goes to make war, not with the child anymore, not with the woman anymore, but with the remnant of the woman's seed. And that is amplified in all of chapter 13. So is this clear? Very important that we understand that this is Revelation chapter 12 is not in chronological order. If you say, I want to know what the sequence of events is going to be, so you start reading in verse 1 through verse 17, and you have all of the events in order, it doesn't work that way. Because the first half of the chapter is amplified in the second half of the chapter. Now, let's continue here. In Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, verses 1 through 10, the focus is on the earthly powers that Satan used to persecute God's people. That's the central focus. In Daniel chapter 7, it's the little horn. And in Revelation chapter 13, it's the beast. The earthly powers that Satan uses throughout the 1260 years primarily to persecute God's people. But in Revelation chapter 12, we find that the real persecuting force behind the little horn and behind the beast is the dragon, Satan. So in other words, Revelation 12 takes you behind the scenes to show that Satan is working behind the little horn and behind the beast in persecuting God's people. Is that point clear? Yeah, these will become clearer as we study along. Now, there are 3 Old Testament contexts that form the background to Revelation chapter 12. 3 Old Testament stories or scenarios that help us understand the story of Revelation chapter 12. The first backdrop is the gospel promise of Genesis 3:15. There's no way we can understand Revelation 12 without taking into account this background, the background of Genesis 3:15. The second backdrop is the exodus of Israel from Egypt. There's no way that we can fully understand the chapter unless we go back to the story of the deliverance of Israel from bondage in Egypt, because that's in the background of Revelation 12. And finally, indispensable for us to consider the story of Elijah, because the story of Elijah is in the backdrop also of Revelation chapter 12. So Revelation 12 depends heavily on the Old Testament. It depends on Genesis 3:15, on the exodus of Israel from Egypt, the story of Elijah, and we're also going to notice that it depends on the little horn prophecy of Daniel chapter 7. So we need to keep that in mind as we study Revelation chapter 12. Now let's take a look at the first backdrop, and basically this material deals with the three backdrops that I've mentioned. Let's take a look at the first backdrop, which is Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. Let's read that verse. And I want you to notice that there are four elements in this verse, which we are going to take into account. Adam and Eve have sinned. God comes down, I believe it's Christ, comes down to the garden to talk to Adam and Eve. And he, of course, pronounces upon them the consequences of what is going to happen as a result of their sin. And then God turns to the serpent in the presence of Adam and Eve. So this is really a promise to Adam and Eve, indirect, because God is here speaking to the serpent, not directly to Adam and Eve, but Adam and Eve are listening according to the context. And so God says to the serpent, this is speaking to the devil, not the literal animal. It says, I will put enmity, that's the first element. I will put enmity between you, this is the second element, the serpent, and the, number 3, woman. And between your seed, that is between the serpent's seed and her seed. So do you see how the enmity is running? The enmity is running between the serpent and the woman, and the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. However, the real enmity is between the serpent and the seed of the woman. Because the last part of the verse tells us, he, that is the seed of the woman, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So do you see the enmity runs in three directions? It runs between the serpent and the woman, between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, but the primary enmity is between the serpent and the woman's seed. That's the primary enmity, although there is enmity between the serpent and the woman as well, and their respective seeds. Is this clear? So once again, four elements: enmity, serpent, woman, and two seeds. Now, the primary enmity, as I was mentioning, is between the serpent and the woman's seed. Then the enmity extends to the woman, and finally against according to this, the remnant of the woman's seed. So there are three enmities revealed in Revelation chapter 12, we're going to notice. First, the dragon goes against the woman's seed. Then he goes against the woman, and finally he goes against the seed of the woman, the seed's seed, if you please. Now, let's take a look at the Exodus backdrop. We've looked briefly at the Genesis 3:15 backdrop. Let's look at the Exodus backdrop, and I'm not going to go in a lot of detail here. I'm just going to mention the main points in the Exodus backdrop. Now, in the Old Testament, God's people are compared to a beautiful woman. And Jeremiah 31 and verse 32 tells us that at Sinai, God married his people Israel. So you have a relationship here between God and Israel. God is the husband, and Israel is his bride, or his wife, his woman, so to speak. What is the fulfillment of this? In Revelation 12, verse 1, God's bride is what? The church. Jesus was the seed of Abraham and the seed of David. Was Jesus born from the Old Testament church? Of course he was. Was he the seed of David? Was he the seed of Abraham? Did he come from the Old Testament woman, so to speak? Absolutely. In other words, Jesus was born from the lineage of the Jewish nation that is from the Old Testament church. Then we have another prophecy which has to do with the Exodus theme. Israel was crying out in travail because of their bitter bondage, right? They had cruel taskmasters. Israel was longing for a deliverer to be born that would deliver them from bondage. Where is that fulfilled? When Jesus was about to be born into this world, the whole of humanity was in bondage to sin. Is that correct? All were in bondage to sin. In Revelation chapter 12, what condition is the woman in? The woman is crying out in pain because she wants the deliverer to be what? To be born. In other words, the pain and anguish of the woman in Revelation 12 are birth pains. Just like Israel was crying out for deliverance from their literal enemies, so the human race is crying out in Revelation chapter 12, verse 2, symbolically, longing for a deliverer to be born. Now, the Bible tells us that the power that had God's people in bondage in Egypt was Pharaoh. And in Ezekiel 29, verse 3, Pharaoh is called the great dragon. Interesting. Pharaoh is called the great dragon. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 3, verse 4, and verse 9, Satan is called the what? Satan is called the great dragon. So you begin to see a parallel here between the Old Testament deliverance of Israel and the New Testament deliverance of God's people. We have another prophecy. A deliverer was born of a woman. And what was his name in the Old Testament? His name was Moses. Now, with whom was this fulfilled? Was a deliverer born in Revelation chapter 12? Most certainly. Who was that deliverer? Jesus. Was Jesus born from the Old Testament church? I underline that once again. He was from the seed of Abraham. He was from the seed of David. Was Pharaoh afraid that he might lose his throne, and therefore he tried to get rid of the child? Absolutely. Was the devil afraid that this seed born of a woman was going to take away his throne? Yes, and that's why he persecutes the seed of the woman. In fact, that takes us to our next point. At the top of page 29, Pharaoh killed all of the infants in order to get rid of the deliverer. Do we find that repeated in Revelation chapter 12? It says that the dragon stood next to the woman to devour her child as soon as her child was born. So where did Moses go? Where did he flee to escape the death sentence? He fled to Egypt. And we're told in Hosea chapter 11 actually, verse 1, out of Egypt I called my son. Who is that really fulfilled in? According to Matthew 2, verse 15, that prophecy is applied to Jesus Christ, who found refuge in Egypt and was taken out of Egypt to return to the promised land. Moses offered a lamb as a sign of deliverance from bondage. What is the fulfillment of the lamb that Moses offered, the Passover lamb? The New Testament says that the fulfillment is none other than Jesus Christ. Our Passover has been sacrificed for us. Israel was baptized in the Red Sea. By the way, the Bible says they were baptized in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It was a baptism. Was Jesus also baptized? Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River. Did Moses fast for 40 days on a mountain in the wilderness? Yes. Was the patience of Moses severely tested because of the attitude of the people? Most certainly. So let me ask you, did Jesus spend 40 days in the wilderness where he was also tested? Absolutely. Did Moses give a law to Israel from a mountain? Absolutely. Did Jesus give the law of his kingdom from a mountain? It's called the Sermon on the Mount. The face of Moses shone on a mountain. Did the face of Jesus shine on a mountain? And lest you think that there's no connection here, go to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where the Apostle Paul explicitly connects what happened with the face of Moses with that happens with the face of Jesus Christ. Did Moses intercede for God's people when they sinned and offer his life in place of theirs? Yes. What does that represent? It represents Jesus, our intercessor. Moses brought water from a rock. But who is that rock? The Apostle Paul says the rock was Christ. Moses established 12 tribes and organized 70. Did Jesus choose 12? Did he also send forth 70? Do you think all of this is just coincidence? No, all of this is the background to Revelation chapter 12. Moses was tested by constant opposition by the Jewish leaders. Was that fulfilled in Jesus? Was Jesus constantly tested by the people and by the leaders of Israel? Absolutely. Moses died, was buried, resurrected, and ascended to heaven. Did Jesus die? Was he buried? Did he resurrect? Then he go to heaven? Absolutely. In fact, in Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 18, a promise was made that one greater than Moses would come. And in Acts chapter 3, and verses 22 to 26, we are explicitly told that that one who was going to be greater than Moses was none other than Jesus Christ. So is there a backdrop of the Exodus in the story of Revelation chapter 12? It's as subtle as a tornado in Kansas. I could have chosen other states, but that's the one that came to mind. So let's notice the principle. Let's notice the principle where it says summary. Literal Moses brings literal deliverance to literal Israel from literal bondage in literal Egypt by offering a literal lamb, takes them across a literal desert, brings literal water from a literal rock, and literal manna from heaven, and raises up a literal serpent to prevent literal death, and leads literal Israel to the borders of literal Canaan. Now, how is this fulfilled? Is it fulfilled literally? Is it fulfilled literally again? No. It's fulfilled symbolically. See, the rock represents something. The serpent represents something. The manna represents something. In other words, you have a spiritual understanding of all the literal things in the Exodus episode. It is obvious that what was literal and local in the Old Testament with literal Israel is to be understood how? In a spiritual and worldwide sense today. So far, so good? All right. Now let's notice a little more carefully the four elements that we find in Revelation 12. We've mentioned them in Genesis 3:15, but now let's go to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 1. Here we are introduced to the woman. Now a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland or a crown of 12 stars. So we have a woman. Now, what does a woman represent in prophecy? It represents the church. But the big question is, when John sees this woman, does this woman represent the Old Testament church, or does this woman represent the New Testament church? The answer is that it represents the Old Testament church. And you say, why does it represent the Old Testament church? Simply because when John sees the woman, the child had not been born yet. Let me ask you a dumb question. Who exists first, the woman or the child? I told you it was a dumb question. The woman exists first, right? And then the child comes from the woman. So, did the Old Testament church exist before Jesus was born? Absolutely. So what Revelation 12 is saying is that from the Old Testament church, God's woman in the Old Testament, if you please, God's bride in the Old Testament, comes forth Jesus Christ. Now, it's important for us to realize, folks, that in the Old Testament you have many women who are not the women, but they prefigure the woman. And we have seeds that women have, and they prefigure the seed, but they are not the fulfillment to the seed as such. Now, we need to ask the question, we know what the woman represents. It represents the Old Testament church. What does the sun represent and the moon? Because it says that she's clothed with the sun, she has the moon under her feet. Well, the fact is that the Bible says very clearly that the sun is the greater light and the moon is what? The moon is the lesser light, we're told in the book of Genesis. Now you say, why is this important? Let me ask you, who is the greater light? The greater light is Jesus Christ. I know we usually say that it's the Bible, but the Bible gives witness to Christ. See, the greater light is Jesus. So the sun represents the fact that this is the church of God. He's going to talk about the time of fulfillment. Let me ask you, where does the moon get its light? From the sun. It's reflected light. Was the Old Testament reflected light? In other words, did it point forward to the time when the sun would come? Absolutely. So the moon represents the Old Testament, which is a shadow which reflects the light, the glorious light of the gospel age when Jesus comes to this world. Now, you'll notice that there's only one woman in Revelation chapter 12. You know, dispensationalists, you know what dispensationalists mean, right? They're futurists. They believe that God has two mutually separable people. God has literal Israel as his people in the Old Testament, and then he sets aside his plan for his first woman, Israel, and then he comes and implements his plan for the church or for the Gentiles. So God has two mutually separable peoples with separate plans for each of them. Revelation 12 totally obliterates that idea. Because in Revelation chapter 12, we find that there's only one woman in all ages. The woman exists in the Old Testament period, and then it brings Jesus into the world. And then we're told that afterwards, the woman flees to the wilderness for 1,260 years. Is it the same woman in the Old Testament and when the church flees in the New Testament? It is the same church. There are not two mutually separable peoples. There is one people of God throughout all ages. And by the way, there is only one Messiah for both. And there's only one dragon who wants to destroy both of them. So we know what the woman represents, the Old Testament church, when John first sees her. Later on, she becomes the New Testament church when she's persecuted. We know in the story what the sun represents. It represents the coming of Jesus when he's going to be born. And the moon represents the Old Testament system that is a reflection that points people's eyes towards the rising of the sun. What is represented by the 12 stars on the head, on the crown of this woman? Well, we don't have to guess. The 12 stars on her crown represent, in the Old Testament, the 12 patriarchs, the 12 sons of Jacob. Were they the founders of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob? Yes. In fact, you have references for all of these. I'm not reading them here because I want you to catch the global picture. You have it in your syllabus and you can read all these texts. That's why we give you from 4 o'clock on free, so that you can go and you can look up all of these verses. I hope that you will do it because there's a lot of material here that we're only covering in principle. So the 12 founders of Israel are the 12 stars when the woman is in the Old Testament stage. Incidentally, you remember the story in Genesis chapter 37, verses 9 and 10, where Joseph had this dream of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And he said 11 stars were bowing before him. Who was the 12th star in that story? Joseph, because there were 12 brothers. And they're spoken of as stars. So that's where this idea comes from, that the 12 stars represent the founders of Israel. But how many apostles did Jesus establish? He established 12. What is Jesus trying to teach? He's saying that the 12 apostles continue the legacy of Israel. It's the same people. 12 founders in the Old Testament, 12 founders in the New Testament. In fact, Ellen White, who I find to always be in harmony with Scripture, had this to say in Acts of the Apostles, page 19. As in the Old Testament, the 12 patriarchs stood as representatives of Israel, so the 12 apostles stood as representatives of the gospel church. So the number 12 represents the two stages of the history of the woman. the Old Testament church and the New Testament church. So far, so good? Now, let's notice the second element in Revelation 12. We've already noticed the woman. Now let's notice the woman's seed. The woman is going to have a child. A seed is going to be born from her. And it says in verse 2, then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. Is she crying out like Israel cried out in the Old Testament? For the deliverance of the child, the deliverer is going to be born. Was Israel sighing and crying for a deliverer? Just read Luke chapter 2, and Luke chapter 3. They were waiting for the consolation of Israel. It says that their hearts were burning for the coming of the Messiah. That you have symbolically portrayed in Revelation 12, where the woman is crying out in labor pains. And so she's crying out in pain. This seed is then born. Who does the seed represent? The seed represents Jesus Christ. So do we have in Genesis chapter 3:15, do we have a woman? Yes. Do we have a seed of the woman in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15? Yeah. Is there enmity there? Let's go to element number 3. This is at the bottom of page 31. And another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great fiery red dragon. And in verse 7 through 9, this dragon is identified as the ancient serpent. Why is he called the ancient serpent? It's saying, hello, Genesis 3:15. It's the same serpent of the past. And so it says, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon. Why is it fiery red? It must be communism, right? Or perhaps it's the Republican Party. Just kidding. No, in the Bible, red represents bloodshed. This is a violent dragon who wants to kill. The context says so. It says it has 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. Now, what does the dragon represent? Let me ask you, does this dragon have a seed? Who is the dragon's seed at the birth of Jesus? Herod. Are you following me? Who tried to kill Jesus? You said Herod. I thought it was the dragon. Doesn't say it was the dragon. It was Satan working through his seed, through Herod. Are you following me or not? And let me ask you, who was the person who brought Jesus into the world? Mary. Are you following me? Now, let's notice what Ellen White had to say about this. This is a statement that is found in Great Controversy, page 438. The line of prophecy in which these symbols are found begins at Revelation 12. Begins with the dragon that sought to destroy Christ at his birth. The dragon is said to be Satan. He it was that moved upon Herod to put the Savior to death. But now notice, but the chief agent of Satan, see that's his seed, right? Is in making war upon Christ and his people during the first centuries of the Christian era was the Roman Empire, in which paganism was the prevailing religion. Thus, while the dragon primarily represents Satan, it is, in a secondary sense, a symbol of what? Pagan Rome. And we could go back to the Old Testament. Who killed Abel? We always say Cain killed Abel. But if you go, and that's true, by the way, but Cain is an instrument of someone else. Because 1 John 3:12 says, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and killed his brother. So you see, behind the visible agent is the dragon, Satan. So can the dragon represent Satan? Yes. Can it represent Rome? Yes. It's the seed of the dragon who is doing this. Now, is element number 4 there as well? Enmity. See, we've noticed that there's a woman. We've noticed that there is a woman's seed. We've noticed that there's a serpent's seed. Well, we've noticed that there's a serpent. Is there enmity here? Of course there is. It says there in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 4, his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to do what? Here's the enmity. To devour her child as soon as it was born. Now, do you remember Genesis 3:15? Who is the primary enmity between? Is there enmity between the serpent and the woman? Yeah. Is there enmity between their respective seeds? Absolutely. But what is the primary enmity? The serpent and the woman's seed. Do we find this beginning Revelation chapter 12? Who is the enmity between? It is between the dragon or the serpent and the woman's seed. First thing he wants to do is destroy the woman's seed. Now, let's say a few things about Revelation 12, 3 and 4, and verses 7 through 12. And I'm going to follow this quite closely. It's a little bit complex, but I think we'll be able to understand it. It is common in the book of Revelation to present the broad sweep of events and group them together. In other words, without any time interval between one event and the other. Let me give you some examples. In Revelation 8, verses 3 through 5, you don't have to look it up, but in Revelation 8, 3 through 5, there is an angel who's standing with a censer in his hand, and then he throws down the censer, and the temple is filled with smoke. Now, if you read Revelation 8, verses 3 through 5, you get the impression that this is happening simultaneously. In other words, he begins to wave the censer, and then he throws it down. But when you carefully examine it, you notice that this is the introductory passage that gives us 2 points of time. It gives us a point of time when the intercession began, and it goes forward to the time when intercession ends, when the censer is thrown down. Now, when you read the introductory passage, it seems like one event follows the other immediately. But the verses are simply giving you the broad sweep, the total picture, and then after that, it's going to give you the details between one event and the other event. Are you following me? Also, Revelation chapter 13 and verse 11. It says there that John sees a beast rising from the earth. It has 2 horns like a lamb and speaks like a dragon. If you read that verse, it gives you the impression that having 2 horns like a lamb and speaking like a dragon happen like that together. But we know that there is an interval of time between when this beast has the 2 horns like a lamb and when he ends up speaking like a dragon. But verse 11 is given you in the introduction the total sweep, the beginning and the end. It's synthesizing it in one verse. And then the following verses are going to amplify the details between one point and the other point. Let me give you another example. Revelation 13, verse 3. It says, I saw one of his heads as if it had been wounded to death, and its deadly wound was healed. Doesn't it sound like it receives a deadly wound and then the wound is healed right away? But when you study the prophecy, you'll notice that there's a time interval. It's giving you both points of time. It's giving you when the deadly wound is given, and then it goes to the end when the deadly wound is healed. And then in the following verses, it's going to explain all of the events that take place in between. Are you understanding what I'm saying? One more example, and there should have been a bullet for this one. Revelation 11, verse 19 says the temple of God was open in heaven, and the ark of his testament was seen. And then it says, and there was thunder and lightning and a great earthquake. Now, if you read that verse, you would think that when the temple of God is open in heaven, immediately there's this earthquake and there's lightning and there's thunder. But no. You see, when you continue studying the rest of Revelation, all the way up to chapter 16, you'll notice that the opening of the temple in heaven occurred in 1844. Whereas the thunder, lightning, and earthquake don't take place until the 7th plague. So basically, Revelation 11:19 is giving you the starting point of the sequence. The starting point is the beginning of the judgment in 1844, but the same verse is giving you the ending point, and then it goes on to explain the events that transpire in between. Is this making sense? And if we don't understand it this way, we are going to get so messed up we won't be able to understand what Revelation is talking about. Now, Revelation 12, verse 4. Let's apply this now to Revelation chapter 12. Revelation 12, verse 4 presents the entire sweep of the great controversy between Christ and Satan, from the origin of sin in heaven until Jesus died on the cross. Verse 4 first gives a flashback into what happened in heaven. Okay? So it takes verse 4 gives you a flashback about what happened in heaven. You know, the tail of the dragon drew a third of the stars from heaven and threw them to the earth. That's what happened originally. But now notice, verse 4 gives a flashback into what happened in heaven and then goes right on to describe the birth of Jesus. Are you catching the picture? So in other words, it's taking you a flashback back to the very beginning of the great controversy, and then it takes you forward in one verse to the birth of the child. But obviously, the dragon did not take a third of the stars down from heaven the very moment that he went to try to kill the child. You have a time interval in between. Now, in verse 7, once again, he gives a flashback to heaven. You know, some people say, well, this is kind of out of order, because it says, then there was war in heaven. I mean, why does it take you from the birth of Jesus all the way back to the war in heaven? Because Revelation is not in strict chronological order. If you're going to understand Revelation, you have to understand how it is organized, how it is structured. And the structure of Revelation is complex. You know, a few years ago, I prepared a syllabus called The Wise Shall Understand, where I deal with the intricate literary structure of Revelation. It's amazing. No human mind could have devised the book of Revelation the way it's written. It is too intricate. It is too perfect. It's amazing. So I want you to notice here in verse 7, once again, he gives a flashback to heaven and then deals with events after the ascension of Jesus. So are you seeing what's happening here? Goes back to heaven in verse 4, then he goes to the birth of Jesus. Then he goes back to heaven, and then he goes to the ascension of Jesus. So verses 3 and 4 are picked up later on in verses 7 through 10 to describe events that take place at the ascension of Christ. So basically, in verse 7, once again, he gives a flashback to heaven and then deals with the events after the ascension of Jesus. So verses 7 through 10 take us a little further forward than verse 3 and verse 5. Because verse 3 and verse 5 takes us only to the birth of Jesus, whereas verses 7 through 12 take us to the ascension of Christ. Is this making sense? Good. The structure of Revelation 12, 3 and 4 is to be understood in the following manner. Here's the summary. Focus on Christ's birth, first of all, verses 3 and 4. First of all, you have a flashback. Before creation, in heaven, the dragon, by his lies, swept 1/3 of the angels, of Christ's angels, from heaven. Is that the original event? Yes. What is the historical event that comes later on? Satan stood before the woman when Jesus was about to be born. So one verse tells you about the origin of this controversy, and the other one of the time when Satan is going to attempt to try and slay the seed. Now, I want you to notice in Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through 12, you have the same basic idea. First of all, you have a flashback. Satan was originally cast out of heaven with his angels. Remember, Michael and his angels fought against the devil and his angels, and no place was found for them in heaven, and they were cast out. The tenses, now notice the tenses of verbs are very important. The tenses of verses 7 through 9 clearly indicate that this is a past event. What is happening between Lucifer and Michael and his angels and the dragon and his angels, this is an event that is past when John is writing. You say, how do we know that? Well, let's notice the tense of the verbs. And war, what? Broke. What tense is that verb? It's an aorist in Greek. It's past. Michael and his angels fought. What tense is the verb? Past. With the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. Is this a flashback to the origin of evil in heaven? Absolutely. Continues saying, but they did. What tense? Past. They did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was, what tense is the verb? Past, was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who, now you have a present participle. John is saying who deceives the whole world. It says, he was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Is this a flashback to the original controversy? Yes, because the purpose is to show where this nasty devil came from who wants to kill the child. Now, verses 10 through 12 are very interesting. They will now describe the consequences of the past event and of the historical event. They will describe, in other words, the heavenly victory celebration when Jesus dies on the cross and when Jesus ascends to heaven. Notice verse 10 and 11, where it says reaction in heaven. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven. Is this what tense? Now he's bringing us to the present, his present. Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before God day and night, has been cast down. See, once again, it goes to the past tense. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives even unto the death. Now, I'm going to skip the following two statements that we find on page 33. Let's go to the top of page 34. You have the reaction in heaven. Are you following me or not? So basically what is happening is Jesus is born. We have an explanation that the dragon who drew a third of the stars in heaven is going to try and kill the child. Then in verses 7 through 10, we have, once again, going back to the origin of the controversy, and then you have the ascension of Christ and the victory of Christ at the cross, carrying us forward. Now, notice Revelation chapter 12 and verse 12. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But now notice, heaven is to rejoice, but what are the earthlings supposed to do? Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you having great wrath, because he knows that he has but a short time. Very, very interesting reaction in heaven. So, is the meaning of Revelation 12, 1 through 5 clear in your mind? But now we need to go to the second division of Revelation chapter 12. The first division of Revelation chapter 12 is chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, which deal with the persecution against the child, with the flashbacks into heaven, and verses 7 through 12, which takes us to the flashback in heaven, and then to the ascension and victory of Christ. But now we need to notice that there's a next stage. The devil was not able to kill the child. He was not able to gain the victory over the child. So now who is he going to go after? He's going to go after the woman. Let's notice the next section in our material, Revelation 12, verse 6 and 13 through 15. Remember, verse 6 is repeated in verses 13 through 15 with additional details. So we need to link verse 6 and verses 13 through 15, and it'll become obvious that we have to do this as we study along. Now, Revelation 12, verse 6 is amplified in Revelation 12, 13 through 15. The devil first wanted to get rid of whom? Of the child. That's what we just studied. When the child escaped, then he goes after the mother of the child. He goes after the woman, in other words. And then finally, when God provides refuge for the woman to escape the ire of the serpent goes against whom? Goes against the remnant of her seed. Now that expression, the remnant of her seed, has been misunderstood. You know, we've said that the remnant of her seed are the last remaining saints that exist in the world. They're the remnant, like the last piece on a roll of material. But really, the seed has already been identified in Revelation chapter 12, hasn't it? Who is the woman's seed? Jesus, right? Clearly, it's explained that the seed of the woman is Jesus. So who is the remnant of her seed? It is the remnant of Jesus. The remnant of Jesus. The last remaining portion of the church of Jesus Christ. Now, Three Old Testament contexts we need to take into account when we deal with Revelation chapter 12, Genesis 3:15, and additionally, we need to deal with Daniel 7 and with the Elijah story. And we're going to dedicate quite a bit of time to these contexts. Now let's read verse 13 through verse 16, through verse 15. It says, "Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child." So his wrath is now being focused against whom? Against the woman that brought the child into the world. "But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly where? Into the wilderness, to her place, where she is nourished." Notice the elements, very important elements. It says that the woman flees to the wilderness, to her place, where she is nourished. How long? Time and times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And it says in verse 15, "So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth." What does water represent? It represents multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. The dragon is using his peoples to do what? That he might cause her, that is the woman, to be carried away by the flood. Those are verses 13 through 15. Now let me ask you, is verse 6 very similar to verses 13 through 16? Let's notice verse 6. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 6. Same elements. It says there in verse 6, "Then the woman," there's the same element, "fled into where? The wilderness, where she has what? A place, that they should what? Feed her." Are these the same concepts that we find later in the chapter? Absolutely. "And feed her there for how long? 1,260 days. Is that the same as times, and the dividing of time? Yes. So must we link Revelation 12 verse 6 with Revelation chapter 12 and verses 13 through 16? We have to connect them. The verses 13 through 16 are amplifying what was already introduced in verse 6. Now the top of page 35. Revelation 12 verse 6 merely introduces the next stage in the drama, but does not tell us why the dragon is enraged with the woman. Simply it says that the woman flees to the wilderness. Does verse 6 give us the reason why the woman has to flee to the wilderness? Does it say the dragon is persecuting the woman? No, it says the woman flees to the wilderness. So the question is, why does she have to flee to the wilderness? Well, verses 13 through 15 give us the reason. They say that when the dragon saw that he had been cast out of heaven, by the way, that happened at the cross as well. Did you know the devil was cast out of heaven at the cross? In fact, in John chapter 12, verses 10 through 12, Jesus was referring to that when he said, "Now is the judgment of this world. Now the prince of this world will be cast out." Now, and he was referring to his death on the cross. He was not physically cast out of heaven, but he was cast out of heaven as the representative of this world. And the sympathies of the heavenly beings were taken away from him when they saw the way that Satan treated Jesus in Gethsemane and on the cross. He was cast out of heaven in the sympathies of the heavenly beings and as the representative of the worlds. He could not go to the heavenly council like he did in the book of Job. He was excluded from representing this world because Jesus became the new representative of the world. Now, a comparison of Daniel 7:25 and Revelation 12:6 and 14 reveals 3 things. Number 1, the woman represents the saints of the Most High. In Daniel 7, it says that the little horn persecuted the saints of the Most High. In Revelation 12, it says that the dragon persecutes the saints of the Most High. So the question is then, who is the woman that is in Revelation chapter 12? Well, Daniel 7:25 says that it's the saints. Revelation chapter 12 says it's the woman. So who is the woman? The woman are the saints. See, Daniel and Revelation explain one another. The second point that we can know is that the power behind the little horn of Daniel 7 is the dragon. Is that clear? See, Daniel 7 says little horn. Revelation 12 says the ancient serpent, the devil and Satan. So we know that the little horn is the emissary of Satan, in other words. And then also the connection between Daniel 7:25 and Revelation chapter 12 and verse 6 is the time period. Time, times, and dividing of time. So is there a link between Daniel 7 and Revelation chapter 12? There's a very clear connection. Ellen White understood this. In Great Controversy, page 439, she stated, for 40 and 2 months, the 40 and 2 months are the same as the time and times and the dividing of time. 3 years and a half, or 1,260 days of Daniel 7. The time during which the papal power was to oppress God's people. This period, as stated in preceding chapters, began with the establishment of the papacy in AD 538 and terminated when? Terminated in 1798. You know, some people are trying to reinterpret this time period. They're saying that the 42 months are future. That the time, times, and dividing of time are future. It's going to be literal time. It's not going to be symbolic time. There's no basis in the spirit of prophecy for such an idea. She says the 42 months and the 1,260 days represent the same period, 538 to 1798. We need to be careful not to insert into prophecy that which is not there, because what it does is it ruins the chain of Bible prophecy, the sequence of events. Now, let's notice Revelation 12, 13 to 15. This is where verse 6 is amplified. Now we're going to discover the real reason why Satan goes after the woman. Verse 6 didn't tell us. Verse 6 simply said that the woman fled to the wilderness. She has a place prepared. There she's nourished for time, times, and the dividing of time. But it doesn't tell us, why did the woman have to flee? Does it have anything to do with the dragon? Well, verses 13 through 15 now amplify and explain. We're going to find in verse 13 that when the dragon saw that he had been cast out, that's the reason, he persecuted the woman who brought the male child into the world. So what is it that enraged Satan? The fact that he had been what? Cast out of heaven. Now notice this statement from Ellen White, Early Writings, pages 191 and 192. This is after Jesus resurrected from the dead. He's come forth from the grave a victor. I am the resurrection and the life. Satan again counseled with his angels, and with bitter hatred against God's government told them that while he retained his power and authority upon earth, their efforts must be tenfold stronger against the followers of Jesus. So he couldn't conquer Jesus, so now he's going to go after whom? The followers of Jesus. They had prevailed nothing against Christ, but must overthrow his followers. See Revelation 12 there? They were not able to conquer Christ because Christ ascended to God and to his throne. So now they go after the followers of Jesus, represented by the woman. It continues saying, in every generation they must seek to ensnare those who would believe in Jesus. He related to his angels that Jesus had given his disciples power to rebuke them and cast them out, and to heal those whom they should afflict. And now notice this. And then Satan's angels went forth like roaring lions, seeking to destroy the followers of Jesus. Does that sound like Revelation chapter 12, where it says that, rejoice, O heavens, you who dwell in them. The accuser is gone. Hallelujah. No more accusations in heaven. The pest is out of here. But woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, knowing that his time is short. What is it that inspired his wrath? The victory of Christ over him through his death and his ascension. Do you see the connection between verses 3 and 4, 7 through 12, with what we have in the following verses? There's a link and a definite connection. Now, verse 14, we just commented on verse 13. Verse 14 mentions that the woman is given 2 wings, the 2 wings of the great eagle. Now, what does that mean? This is a symbolism that is used in the exodus of Israel from Egypt. God says, I took you on eagle's wings. Now, an eagle is notorious for being swift, powerful, flies high, and protects its young like the apple of its eye. This is the same way that Jesus feels about his persecuted people. In fact, in Exodus 19, verse 4, God says, I took you on eagle's wings. I delivered you from the oppressor. I delivered you from he who had you in bondage to take you to the promised land. And then I want you to notice verse 15. This is a very significant verse. Verse 15. Are we doing well so far? You've been able to follow me along? We're going as fast as we can because we have so much material to cover. But notice Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12 has a very important detail that very seldom is ever touched upon. How many heads does this dragon beast of Revelation chapter 12 have? It has 7 heads. So how many mouths must it have? It must have 7 mouths if it has 7 heads. But now I want you to notice a very interesting detail that we'll pick up on when we deal with Revelation chapter 17. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 15. The woman has fled to the wilderness. She's sustained. She's fed there. And then it says, so the serpent, who is the same as the dragon, right? He's called the dragon, the ancient serpent, the devil, and Satan. And so the serpent is the same as the dragon. It says, so the serpent spewed water out of his mouth. Singular. How many heads are functioning at a given time? 1. Even though this dragon beast has 7 heads, only one of them is spewing water out of its mouth. Remember, just keep that in mind because we're going to see that this is very significant. In Revelation chapter 13, how many heads does the beast of Revelation 13 have? The beast that comes from the sea. 7 heads. And yet it says, I saw one of his heads as though it had been wounded to death. So the point is that only one of the 7 heads is functioning at any given time, is spewing waters of persecution out. Are you understanding me? Actually, we're going to see that the 7 heads represent the 7 consecutive powers that rule, beginning with Babylon and ending with the restoration of the papacy at the end of time. They are stages in which God's people were persecuted. And only one power is actually doing that at a time, not all 7 doing it at the same time. We'll deal with that a little bit later. So even though the dragon or serpent had 7 heads, only one head is spewing out water. When we come to Revelation 17, we will deal more extensively with this.
Visit secretsunsealed.org for annual class dates and topics. Anchor is a seminary-level course of study on the fundamentals of Seventh-day Adventist theology taught by Pastor Stephen Bohr and guest theologians. Seating is limited.